themselves as well. Okay. So let's examine these perspectives with looking at the ENSEL intensification framework, which I'll put up in just a moment. What I want us to think about before we get to that slide is to really consider how do we modulate all of the factors that we need to think about when we intensify instruction. So we need some of this, we need a little bit of that, we need a lot of this piece, and we do all of that looking at data. So all of the adaptations, all of the instruction that we provide really must be driven by data. So I'm going to give you just a moment to look at the ENSEL intensification framework. You will be provided a link to a brief that is on the ENSEL website, and it outlines how they went about developing this framework and this way to really think about the instruction that we need to provide when we begin to layer on more intense interventional techniques, more explicit instructional techniques when we are designing the instruction for the students. So I'm going to be quiet for just a moment and let you take in the slide and look at all of the various factors and information that's provided on the slide. If everyone is fine, I'm going to go ahead and move on. We are going to look very explicitly at each of the areas within the intensification framework. And what we begin with is reading content. So we're talking about literacy instruction for students. Let's focus in on reading content. And you'll notice that we display the 5 components of reading instruction that were identified by the National Reading Panel's report. We note phonological awareness, alphabetic principle or alphabetic understanding, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Our ultimate goal is around comprehension, but we need to make sure that we include the other pieces that are so very important in thinking about reading instruction. We know a lot from research in regard to each of these content components, and we know how they interweave to begin to lead students to being able to comprehend what they read. We think about phonological awareness and we consider phonemic awareness, which is a really critical piece that leads us to understanding the alphabetic principle, understanding phonics instruction, decoding, encoding, critical pieces that we must make sure students understand, leading to making sure that students can recognize text automatically, accurately, and with prosody as they're reading. We need to increase their vocabulary with to a great depth, but also with a great breadth of understanding as well. And all of this work is going to lead students to being able to engage with text and to comprehend what they're reading. Another component of the ENSEL intensification framework really begins to consider also the cognitive processing of students. So when we think about working memory of students who are really struggling, there's a lot to consider because many of the students that are not making the growth that we might have expected are experiencing some issues with working memory. And we need to consider the design and delivery of our instruction to support any needs the student might have in ameliorating the working memory challenges that they might encounter. We also need to think about self-regulation. Are there many students that we need to cue throughout our instruction to make sure that they are attending to what we're providing? Are they able to engage with what we're providing? Are they able to accomplish what we're asking them to do between working memory and self-regulation? But then we do know very clearly that self-efficacy is extremely important for students to engage with the learning that we're expecting of them. We know that confidence in the skills is critically important. And when we reach competence, or when students reach competence, they can feel confident. So we think about John Hattie's work in regard to that. And we know the effect size that confidence and self-efficacy brings with it. We also need to consider the instructional design that we're using to provide the reading instruction that we're delivering to students. Instruction needs to be explicit, it needs to be systematic. We need to think about front end scaffolds, we need to think about back end scaffolds. Are we going to pre-teach some information to students so that they can more easily engage with the Tier 1 instruction? So are we going to preload some of that instruction, maybe at Tier 2, so that they can engage with that at Tier 1? We need to make sure that our examples, when we are providing instruction, align with exactly what we're instructing on. We need to make sure that we cycle back repeatedly through lessons to make sure that students are engaging continuously with the information that we want them to know and understand. And then we want them to reach mastery and automaticity with the work that we're asking them to engage with. And then finally, we really do need to think about instructional delivery. How much time are we going to spend on that? What is the duration of the intervention that we might be providing? What is the duration of the lesson? How long over time will we also deliver that instruction? So multiple ways to think about duration. What is the group size that we need to consider? What are the members, or who are the members of the group that we need to consider? Are we looking at heterogeneous grouping, or are we becoming more intense with our grouping and looking at homogeneous grouping? And then pacing can be quite challenging as well. We need to go as fast as we can, but as slow as we need to as well. So that sweet spot between making sure that students are moving forward and that we are accelerating learning very consistently for students as well. So let's begin to think about examples for intensification of instruction for students. How are we going to consider what it looks like at Tier 3 in regard to the reading content section that we looked at? We know phonemic awareness is extremely important for students to engage with. We also know from research that we must begin phonemic awareness activities at kindergarten because of that very strong link that is made between phonemic awareness and a student's ability to be able to decode and encode. So our more intense work might be around segmenting and blending of phonemic awareness activities. When we think about phonics instruction or alphabetic understanding, we may want to intensify by linking the phonemic awareness work with the phonics work. We also know that some students may actually need letters or graphemes provided with their phonemic awareness work because they need that for engagement. And research tells us that there are few numbers of students who may need that work. But when we also think about phonics instruction and alphabetic understanding, we may need to intensify the work we do in regard to spelling. We need to link perhaps decoding and encoding back to back when we provide those more intense interventions. But then let's think about fluency. We know that accuracy must come first, but then we need to also think about automaticity and prosody as well in regard to those relationships. But we need for students to be able to analyze the structure of words so that they have strategies for being able to become accurate and automatic with the words that they're reading, with the text that they're engaging with. When we think about vocabulary, we need to think about a process that will support students being able to engage with vocabulary and understand the vocabulary that we want them to be able to work through and to be able to work with. We also need to think about how are we going to more explicitly engage with comprehension and knowledge building. We need to think about explicitly teaching students to engage with text through questioning strategies, through different structures that we might provide, through the use of graphic organizers that are designed to walk students through a process. We might engage with teaching students text structures, which are research-based, to help students to be able to engage with the text that they're reading. So when we think about examples of intensifying instruction, we need to think about in what areas are we really needing to intensify that instruction? In what areas are we needing to engage and connect for students as well? But we also need to think about if students have issues around working memory, how are we going to incorporate strategies that will support use of self-monitoring skills or use of tools to support those needs around working memory? And so we need to think about cognitive load and how we're going to think about that in regard to what we provide. So we might integrate writing with whatever it is that we're working with. We might integrate checklists that students can walk through to make sure that they are monitoring their own progress as they move through the instruction that we provide. We might use models and demonstrations. And I know very often when we think about explicit instruction, they talk about modeling or think aloud. I think it's critically important that when we model, we also think aloud because so often students don't know what they should be thinking as they're engaging with instruction or as they're engaging with a process. So we need to provide that as much as the model that we're looking to provide for them as well. And we need to make sure that they have understood the model and that they are able to walk through the model themselves. So we might model something for them, but we might model that as you're walking through this process, you're going to check your checklist. Okay, that was step one. I'm going to check it off. Let's move on to the next step that we're going to do. We'll complete that step and then we might model checking again with our checklist. So it's not only modeling the instruction in reading that we need to provide the model for, we also need to provide the model for the use of the checklist as well. We also need to provide that thinking aloud for students so that they know what they should be thinking as well. And so when we look at the next piece in regard to inhibitory control, excuse me, it's later in the evening. We need to think about, again, that think aloud strategy, self-talk, incorporating checklists for students, prompt lists, and so on. And then finally, in regard to self-efficacy, how do we create that feeling or that understanding that when students have engaged, they've mastered, they're working toward a goal, and they are understanding that they are making progress? I know that we've listed several here, but one of the pieces that I think is extremely critical in regard to this is feedback. The way we provide feedback to students as we move through a process is extremely critical. And I think about John Hattie and Gregory Yates' work around providing feedback, and that we need to think about explicit instructional techniques. We need to provide our feedback all along the way, and we need to let students know what they do well and give them a nugget to grow to the next step as well. And so all along the way, we're supporting, yes, you've done well with this. This is what you need to move to the next step as well. And with providing feedback in that way, we can really support and build self-efficacy. We also know that goal setting and graphing is highly motivational for students as well, particularly when they do it themselves. And so we're able to do that with older students. And when we really are looking at targets, so we know when we're intensifying instructional delivery, we really do want to look at a target. We want to close the gap. And I know I went this way and I should have gone this way. We want to make sure that we close the gap and we reach our target. And we may have a visual graph for the student to use in marking their own progress. And that will help support self-efficacy as well. So when we are thinking about and moving into the next piece of what we're going to talk about and think about, I want us to consider tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And we've talked a little bit about that. At tier 1, this is where we're going to provide the instruction for all students. And with much of the work that we're hearing these days, we also are encouraging the use of explicit instruction at tier 1 as well, because we're capturing more students with explicit instruction. What we do know is that explicit instruction harms no child. It's critical for some children, and it's really necessary, or it's perfectly fine for other students as well. So even at tier 1, we may be using explicit instructional techniques, which means we really need to think about how are we going to layer on at tier 2 even more intensity or more explicit instructional techniques, and then at tier 3. How are we going to layer on there as well? And then if we're providing specially designed instruction for students, how are we going to intensify even at that point as well? And so we're going to think and talk about explicit and systematic instruction. I think it's very difficult for us to separate explicit and systematic because sometimes when we use explicit instruction, we need to think about systematizing that as well or making that instruction systematic. And I'm going to give us an example in just a moment. But let's think about the components of explicit instruction. We make sure that we know that students know the learning target that we're working toward. So we give them an advanced organizer so that they know what they're engaging with, what we're expecting them to do. We know that the teacher will do modeling, but we're going to provide various opportunities for practice. We might use a signal for students to cue students. We might make sure that we review judiciously what they've learned previously and incorporate that with what we're currently learning. We're going to go at an appropriate pace. We're going to use corrective feedback, as I mentioned just a moment ago, but we're also going to provide that nugget to help them grow. We're going to continually check for understanding. And then the components of systematic instruction, we're going to break activities down into smaller steps or into smaller components. We're also going to think about those smaller steps being sequential. We want to move from the more simple to the more complex. We want to make sure that students have the prior knowledge they need or the prerequisite skills that are required for learning a new skill. But I also want us to think about if we're designing something with explicit instruction, and I often think about breaking complex tasks down into smaller steps or smaller components as being an explicit instructional technique. But I need to make sure that those steps and components are sequential. So in that way, I'm really combining what is systematic with what is explicit. So again, I think it's very difficult for us to separate these out very often because we need to think about what explicit instruction are we providing, what has already been providing, and how are we systematizing that for students as well to be able to engage with. So one of the pieces I want us to think about now is maybe we need to begin to think about pre-teaching at tier 2 to support tier 1 learning. So in front of us, we have a foundational skills lesson that lasts about 30 minutes. And you notice that we're going to, within the time frame, we're looking at irregular word reading. We're going to work on decoding skills. And as we work on decoding skills, we're also going to work on phonemic awareness within that section. We're looking at sound and spelling introduction and review, blended practice, regular word reading. Then, to support the work that we've done within that previous section, we're going to use decodable text for reading so that we are now practicing what we have learned within our decoding skills section. And then we're going to encode. I know that various core programs, various intervention programs, various supplemental programs conduct a lesson in a slightly different manner. But you see that these components are included here in a sequential order. And we've built from phonemic awareness to encoding. So we've gone from the simple to the more complex. We've included irregular word reading at the very beginning to make sure that students are engaging with that work as well. You can see that we spend 10 to 15 minutes on the first section, 12 to 15 minutes on the next section, and then 3 to 5 on the subsequent section or last section. But now at Tier 2, we're going to pre-teach the same lesson so that students are able to engage with that. Will we use the same words, the same content? We will not use probably the same words, but we will use the same type of content. And what we're helping is that students will then be able to engage within the Tier 1 lesson. So I'm going to go back to the Tier 1 lesson. By providing the pre-teaching of this lesson, we're hoping that students will be able to engage in the Tier 1 lesson with more participation, with more engagement, and they'll feel more efficacious because they have reviewed and understand these foundational skills that they're working on now as well. Plus, they're now provided extra practice. They are going to work on irregular word reading. The decoding skills section and progression is really conducted in the very same way. They'll support what they've learned with the decoding skills by reading decodable text. And then we're going to follow up almost immediately with the encoding section. So we have that back-to-back decoding and encoding. So the receptive and expressive activities, building toward being able to accomplish those expressive activities. But what might this look like at Tier 3? How will we think about this when we're intensifying at Tier 3? So at Tier 3, we see, excuse me, the same lesson format provided, but what we're going to do is to intensify our work in certain areas because these are areas that need more support at Tier 3 because of the work that's being done at Tier 1 and Tier 2. And the students, we found that they needed more work around these pieces from some sort of data that was provided. So again, we're making these instructional decisions using data throughout. And if you'll recall, when we looked at the intensification framework, everything is driven by data. And at some point, too, we'll hopefully drop in a data-based intensification piece as well. So we'll make sure that you get that link as well. But at Tier 3, we're really going to intensify instruction even further to work on skills within that format that need more intensification. In this instance, we're going to intensify and add more phonemic awareness instruction. And we're also going to intensify and add more word reading instruction, particularly in regard to the blending practice. So we may orthographically map sounds, phonemes to graphemes, but then we're going to blend them together as well and do a little bit more work there. Again, we're going to use data to determine once a student has been able to accomplish that piece. Okay. So in the chat will be placed a checklist from the National Center on Intensive Interventions. It's a really great checklist. And as we go through subsequent slides, I'm hoping that you'll refer to the checklist. I'm going to click on the image and take us there. Hopefully it will take us there because I'd really like to show you this tool that is available. And a link has been placed in the chat for you as well so that you can look at the tool on your own as well. But when we think about intervention and intensification, we really do need to think about, do we have a strategy checklist that we might look at? And with your session with Jess Searles, I don't know if she provided this strategy checklist or not, but within the checklist, we also have examples of explicit instruction. So let's just walk through the checklist that's provided to see what it provides for us. So we need to think about and remember dosage was really something we needed to consider in regard to delivery of the instruction that we are about to provide. And this really supports that thinking around what is the length of the intervention sessions? What is the number that we're going to provide of those sessions? We're going to look at either decreasing the group size or making the group more heterogeneous. We might increase the total number of sessions, but you can see that you have a checklist to begin to think about what might dosage look like at tier 3 or for specially designed instruction. Does it align with the instruction that we're providing, and we need to intensify in regard to that? So, what is the instructional time for the target skill that the student is really struggling with? The supplemental or the intervention from the center provides materials in regard to reading and math and behavior as well. We in Virginia have the benefit of having some approved supplemental and intervention programs as well that we can refer to in regard to reading. But the National Center on Intensive Intervention also provides us some information around math and behavior as well. But we need to focus on that discrete skill instruction that's within the target skill that we know we're working toward. We need to pay attention to or attend to transfer. So within the work that we're doing that's more intense, how will that skill transfer back in to the work that the student is doing at tier 1 and tier 2? Are we explicitly teaching those connections? I think about the work also in regard to the skills we're working on transferring outside of that isolated situation where you're working with students. So often we'll work with students in isolation in regard to skill development. Do we prepare them to generalize that skill outside of that isolated situation where we're teaching or working on that isolated skill? But then this is the section that I was thinking that perhaps Jess had shared during her session. We have elements of explicit instruction or a list to help us with elements of explicit instruction as well. To think about modeling, which we've mentioned several times, using very precise and simple language to teach key concepts. The other thing I think about too is using that same language consistently. So we want students to have in their minds exactly what we want them to be able to do. And when our language is clear, simple, and explicit and consistent, that will help the student develop those skills as well. We need to think about here, I see faded steps from examples. So that gradual release methodology that we think about so often, I do, you do, we do. Do we provide sufficient time for providing opportunities to practice? Do we provide feedback all along the way to create self-efficacy for students and feeling of confidence and competence? Then we need to think about behavior engagement and motivation support throughout this more intense intervention that we're providing for students. And then there's some other considerations as well. So the checklist can be very helpful for you to think about the instructional design that you might use and the instructional delivery. So let's go back to the PowerPoint, if you will, with me. And let's begin to think about applying some that we have discussed. So we did talk about the explicit instructional techniques of gradual release, but this looks like a little bit more intense work than we might originally have thought. So we always think about I do, we do, you do. But even at tier one, we may need to intensify that work. So we may have one I do, but we may have multiple we do's. And we may even reconfigure the we do so that the students work with the teacher, then they work in partnerships together before we move to the you do. But what's extremely important here, and you can see it through tier two and through tier three as well, is that we need to reach the you do piece because we need to know what students are able to do. We can't assume, we need to know that they're able to complete the tasks successfully that we're asking them to accomplish. So when we look at tier two with this very simple model of gradual release, I do has been multiplied times two, but then the we do we've increased to even more times and opportunities for the collaboration between teacher and students, and then between students themselves before we move to the you do piece. And then even with the you do piece, the student, we might break that work down into its component parts or smaller steps and provide feedback all along the way. I know here it says peer feedback. We might also consider teacher feedback as well, even at tier two. And then think about tier three. We've increased the modeling here to 3 times. We may need to increase it even further. We think about the we do piece where we've intensified that with teachers guiding the we do section even more partnering with their peers. We've increased then the we do back together with teachers. And then we've looked at the you do piece with teacher feedback provided in both instances. So we might also want to explore another guide that will be placed in the chat for you as well. And I'm not sure if Jess shared this or not, but there are 10 key principles around explicit instructional policies and practices that comes to us from the Meadow Center at the University of Texas at Austin. That provides us a great guide in thinking about explicit instructional techniques. So I know that you see a lot on this slide at the moment, and it may seem overwhelming. What I'd like to do in the subsequent slides is to break it down just a bit. So don't be alarmed and think, oh my gosh, this is a lot. I'm going to break each tier down in subsequent slides, but I want us to think about this in an overall view that this is what we're doing at tier one, and it is explicit. This is what we're providing at tier two, and it's more explicit. But this is what we're providing at tier three, and it's even more explicit than we saw at tier one. So when I talk about layering on, I'm really thinking about, I'm going to begin with explicit instructional techniques, but I'm really going to layer on intensity by providing even more explicit instructional techniques or practices. And then at tier three, I may need to think of layering on even more. Okay, so let's begin to break this down and think about what's happening at tier one with this instruction. You notice that as we talked about earlier, that the teacher does provide the learning target and discusses that. That was an explicit instructional technique. but the teacher is also going to describe and explain the main idea and details from the reading passage. So we see right away that this particular lesson is designed around finding main idea and details. And that we're working on a passage of reading where we're identifying that work. The teacher is going to model identifying them in the passage. So the class reads a passage together. The students discuss the main idea and details that they locate. The teacher checks for understanding of the passage from the students. So you've noticed we've provided that learning target. Students know what they're going to be doing. The teacher describes and models for them what they're to be doing. The class then does that together. And the teacher then checks to make sure that they've understood that. Now the students are going to put that information into a graphic organizer that they complete together. And from that graphic organizer, the students are going to begin to write a paragraph on their findings relating to main idea and details. So they're going to begin to summarize what they have read. So you can see that sequential process that they're moving through. You can see the I do, we do, you do methodology of gradual release. You can also see the use of a graphic organizer or a visual that the students will be engaging with, and then they're going to move into writing. Okay. Let's think about what they're doing now at Tier 2, where students might need a bit more support. What we notice is that the teacher will display and discuss the learning target. They are connecting with the instruction that was provided at Tier 1. The teacher is going to provide a passage and use the modeling and think aloud to identify the main idea and details. So the teacher is going to be even more explicit in regard to what she or he is doing in regard to providing that instruction. But then the teacher is going to also model the use of the graphic organizer at that point. So at Tier 2, the teacher has modeled multiple pieces, but then the teacher is going to, with the students, use another text and complete the work that the teacher just did with the modeling piece or the I do piece, and walk entirely through that process through to the graphic organizer before the students are using the graphic organizer on their own as partners. Okay, so the teacher has modeled very explicitly. The teacher has done this work again with the students, so the we do portion, before the teacher has ever let loose the students on the graphic organizers with partners. And partners is still that we do piece. But then we may need to scaffold the writing process. So we may have information about the students using data that says they may have difficulty organizing the paragraph that we want them to engage with. And so we're going to need to maybe scaffold that a bit at Tier 2. So what we're going to do here at Tier 2 is to have them retell the main idea and details before they write, and then do some writing. Okay. So what might this look like at Tier 3? But what I also want to share with you all or highlight for you all, again, is that document from Sharon Vaughn's group around explicit instructional techniques. But let's think about Tier 3. And what do we need to consider when we are working with students at this particular tier in regard to understanding key concepts around main idea and details? So again, we're going to make sure that students understand the learning target, but we're going to intensify that work, perhaps using recommendations from the Foundational Skills to Support Reading for Understanding in Kindergarten through 3rd grade. This is an IES practice guide that delivers this very important information around what we need to think about. So maybe we need to think about teaching explicitly the academic language being used. We might use one of the suggested techniques within the practice guide that's provided. A link will be provided later to this particular IES practice guide. And if anyone is interested, I have downloaded all of the IES practice guides that are currently available, and I'm happy to share in whatever way we might figure out. But I have downloaded them, so if you are in need of them, I do have them. And so we're going to think in those terms of even more explicit, more intense intervention around teaching even more about what is the main idea within a paragraph, what are the supported details, how are they linked together, and we're going to provide context, evidence, and elaboration for the main idea piece. And then over time, we're going to practice identifying main ideas. So you notice we're not thinking about combining all of the graphic organizer work with identifying the main idea and detail work. We're just practicing identifying main ideas and details, not only in informative text, but also in narrative text. We might even want to consider blocked practice versus interleaved practice with the work that we're doing. With each of the whole group practice sessions, the teacher will begin with a model before she works with the students on doing the work together. So you can see how the instructional pathway has become even more intense. And what might happen next after they've practiced identifying main idea and details is they might begin working on putting that information into a graphic organizer. But the work around the use of the graphic organizer might be even more intense as well. And then some of the students at this level maybe need more intense instruction around writing. And so they may even need another sort of intense intervention in regard to being able to write complete sentences and including those in a paragraph. So you can see across the tiers how we have increased the intensity and targeted the skills that students might need more support with. I'd like to think about another. So I did an example at grade 3 in elementary, but I'd like to do another example for older students. And we might even need to think about the another IES practice guide and a recommendation from that practice guide. This one is providing interventions in grades 4 through 9. And let's examine recommendation number 1 that talks about multisyllabic decoding and morphologic awareness for intensifying instruction. The link to this particular practice guide will be provided as well. But let's think about from the intensification framework, what do we need to consider? So in what area of content are the skills that we need to think about? Well, they're in reading, they're in phonics, but they're also moving into vocabulary. So when we think about syllables, we're thinking about parts of words, but then we need to move on for older students into thinking about morphemes, which are word parts with meaning. So how are we going to explicitly instruct students in regard to this skill development? And for older students, we know this is extremely critical. So we're going to think about phonics and vocabulary instruction, as I mentioned just a moment ago. We're going to think about explicit techniques of segmenting complex skills into smaller, more manageable increments, such as teaching syllable types, teaching syllable division principles, but then moving to morphemes. And so across the bottom, I put several research bases in regard to syllable division principles. In almost every one of them, what we need to think about is noticing the vowels. If you're interested in the research for this, I can certainly provide that information to the organizers. And if they send out anything to those who are participating, I'm happy to share the research behind each of these. But we need to think about how are we going to explicitly teach syllable division principles? How are we going to teach students to think about dividing words when they're made or comprised of morphemes as well? So moving to a higher order of thinking also. So again, we're going to think about the recommendation that comes to us from the IES practice guide in relationship to morphology. And as we move to even the most intense intervention, there are a couple of thing, couple of I don't want to say programs because they're not programs. There are recommendations and there are explicit instructional strategies for providing this even more intense intervention. One of them I've linked here, and it will also be provided within the chat for you. But it's Intensive Intervention Practice Guide on Explicit Morphology Instruction to improve overall literacy skills for secondary students. But we also may need to think about other types of even more explicit instruction where we might think about a sim learning strategy thinking about word identification strategy or word mapping strategies. And these are only strategies that are very explicitly designed to not only for the teacher, but also for the student to help move through these various tiers. So we know at tier one for older students, we're going to directly teach them morphology. Morphology is in the standards, so we must be teaching morphology. For students that are beginning to struggle, they must understand the basics of understanding syllable types, but they also must understand how to divide syllables and that are words into syllables, but they also must understand how to divide morphemes. So moving through those various layers of the language to reach the point where older students are engaging with understanding morphemes as word parts. And we have the various layers that we can move through. Okay. So I'm hoping that while we've been together, that you've been thinking about the literacy skills within the coursework that you are providing. And have you thought about a way that you might apply even more intense instructional techniques to the students that you're working with? So I'm hoping that you've begun to think about this layering on process. You have several tools available to you to begin to think about that. And so I would encourage you to begin to think about how am I going to intensify the work that I need to intensify for students when they're not making the progress that I need for them to make. In the chat will be placed this link to a Google folder for the resources that I provided throughout the session. There's also the brief that I talked about around the ENSEL intensification framework. ENSEL has just relaunched its website, and so I have downloaded the intensification framework brief within this Google folder, but you can also click on their newly launched site to find that brief as well. So I'm not sure I'm able to get questions. Is there a way, if anyone has any questions, that we do this? Or would you all like to move forward and then at the very end, people can ask more questions? Okay, excellent. So if you have questions, we'll allow for that at the very end. I do want you all to be aware that ENSEL accepts targeted assistance requests. So if you have a particular request, this is the site that you might go to. The link will be provided within the chat. And then ENSEL always must get your feedback in regard to a session that's being provided. They are grant funded, and so feedback is extremely important. So if you would take an opportunity to provide feedback, it would be greatly appreciated. The link will also be placed in the chat, and then here is a QR code for you to use as well. So
All
Jen, would
right.
you like me to hover a little bit here or would you like me to move forward?
You can hover for just a second, just so I can let everyone know that that TA request for Ensel as well as the evaluation link are in the chat. Just above that is the resource folder with all of the great resources that Mary has shared with us this evening. Wow, Mary, thank you. What a wealth of information and resources you've put together for us.
Thank
So
you.
thank you very much. And as Mary said, if you can please access that evaluation link, it is in the chat for you. So we want to go ahead as we wrap up in this last minute and do our giveaway, what you've all excitedly been waiting for. I'm going to share our screen for just 1 minute, Mary, if that's okay.